No, it's
And to
okay.
think I
It's
watched
okay to
all
talk
this white
about
cinema for this
class.
show.
It's a good segue to talking about class.
Um, I watched. So I reread the article again last night, and then I watched Gattaca actually,
Oh yeah.
because reading the article, I thought I don't want to watch The Talented Mr. Ripley. But I remember Gattaca, which also has Jude Law, and that was kind of a similar story of different in the context
Uh-oh.
heuristic society where you can imagine the futures of your child, and if you have your child naturally, then you're relegated to a lower status in life in general. You'll never be able to get certain jobs or whatever. And then the guy masquerades as Jude Law, which Talented Mr. Ripley, similar story. Uh, Jason Bourne, what's his name again?
Matt Damon.
Matt Damon.
Matt Damon masquerades as Jude Law, and of course kills him and kills a bunch of other people. But I have to ask the question: is Talented Mr. Ripley kind of a white version of Native Son? Because it reminded me a lot of the Bigger Thomas character.
That's so interesting. Because so full disclosure, I have not read the Richard Wright novel, so I can't speak to this in any.
That's fine. Like nobody really has.
I actually got it mixed up with James Baldwin's Notes from a Native Son, because I did read that like way back in college,
Mhm.
and I do like a lot of Baldwin's writing. I don't know Richard Wright's writing as well. I mean, my understanding Patricia Highsmith wrote the novel.
In the 50s.
Yeah, that the movie was based on. And I actually had the idea, Jason, for this piece that I wanted to write long before I actually saw Talented Mr. Ripley. Like, I knew what it was, but I hadn't actually seen the whole movie. And then when I rewatched it, or no, I shouldn't say rewatched it, when I really watched the whole thing for the first time, like back in May, I thought, okay, this movie dovetails with all sorts of things going on in the W. David Marks book. So I knew I wanted to write in the W. David Marks book because I thought it was a really interesting book, and I agreed with like 90% of it. But then I felt like the 10% I didn't agree with was actually the most interesting as far as how it related to my own life. So yeah, I wish I could do more in the Richard Wright vein. Why don't you tell us why it reminds you of Native Son?
I think you have a similar story of someone that kind of accidentally finds themselves in an entirely new element. I mean, the Talented Mr. Ripley, Matt Damon's character, is kind of accidentally vaulted into high society. He does work at Princeton as a piano tuner, I think, and then he was a bathroom attendant at a high end theater. But he's not really in these places in a comfortable setting. When you're the help, it feels different. I don't know if you've ever been. I know you say in your piece you actually worked at a high-end restaurant. It's a very different feeling when you're picking up things for people, opposed to when there's an arm around you and they're talking to you as if you're an equal. And for those that don't know the movie, I know maybe some of our younger viewers haven't watched it, because I don't know. And I wanted to ask you this too: do you think that movie is a little too unrelatable? To your point about your piece, because we don't really see wealthy people in that same light like we did with the Talented Mr. Ripley, where they literally have a different language that they speak, food that they eat, mannerisms, the way they dress. Like, he had to do so much to try to fit in.
I feel like, so in a way, what was disturbing watching it is that, like, in a way, I actually identified with Ripley, who's in some ways a really sympathetic character, but in other ways, of course, it's not. And I'm seeing like comments like, no spoilers for the movie.
It's 20 years old. If you haven't seen it now, F you. You're gonna it ends. He kills everybody.
I mean, I think that what I thought was interesting and disturbing at the same time was how much I identified with Ripley. So there's one level at which I think that this idea of assimilation, or seeming like you understand the codes, or seeming like you understand the references, kind of pretending, and then the better you pretend, the more easily accepted or embraced you are by a group that, in terms of economic class, you don't belong to. That was something I felt like I really related to personally. And so it was fascinating to me that on one level, okay, no, like we don't have these conspicuous codes that demarcate like the 1% from the top 10%, from the top 20%, because so many people dress in a way and comport themselves in a way that is much less conspicuously class-based. So like going to the opera or listening to classical music, or wearing like designer clothing doesn't necessarily mean that you are from one class versus another. I mean, I do think there are codes today that are less conspicuous, or that are actually harder to see, that help distinguish between different economic classes, but nothing as entrenched as what you're pointing out in Talented Mr. Ripley. And it's set during like mid 20th century.
Yeah.
So what I thought was interesting about the movie is how much I like related to it in terms of like pretending and like performing a certain class level. And I think part of that, I mean, you mentioned waiting tables, but I really feel like beyond waiting tables, I also felt like I was doing that in graduate school. I still feel like I'm doing that sometimes as a faculty member at one of the richest undergraduate institutions in the country. Most of my students just don't have the same kind of class background as I do. So there's a way in which if you're one of the few people who is not from wealth, you do kind of have to pretend to a certain extent, even if the semiotics or the markers, the visual markers or the verbal markers may not be as obvious. So that was one of the reasons why I kind of tied it in, is because I felt like, okay, yes, it's very different. Like today's situation with class signifying is very different than it was back then. But then at the same time, the fact that I still sympathize with this guy at all is, I don't know, alarming, but fascinating as well.